really know where else to turn besides here. I'm a mental health counselor in a psychiatric hospital. Just talking about this is breaking almost all my oaths, but I can't keep this to myself. I feel that would be irresponsible. I spent several years doing what I could for patients suffering from depression, suicidal ideation, and anxiety disorders. That was what I was good at. Talking people down from a ledge they wouldn't be able to climb back up from. Every morning I'd wake up, put on my slacks and sweater, and head to work. As a fairly intimate psychiatrist, I can admit that some days it can be rather difficult to listen to patients speak about what's going on in their lives. Luckily for me, the ones I deem to be suffering from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or any other trait that involves a deeper level of counseling than I can provide, are sent to the experts. However, the most difficult stories for me to listen to are the patients that have hit a string of bad luck, sometimes spanning their whole lives. A lot of these people are good, wonderful people that saw the end of the line approaching and sought out help. These people hurt me the most. Maybe I can see a part of myself in them, or maybe seeing the injustice of life and luck strikes a deep chord in me. But it's these people I refuse to give up on. I can't fix their issues, but I can change their focus. I can remind them that there's a world of connections they made, and to sever it would be catastrophic in many different ways. I'm telling you this because I don't give up on patients. I didn't give up on Luke. A few months ago, I was alerted that the ER was shipping us a patient for intake. This kind of thing usually happens after a failed suicide attempt, and the hospital staff doesn't think the patient is safe enough to return home. As soon as I got the alert, I rushed over to the behavioral health unit and waited outside the in-processing room. I had made close friends with the staff and felt comfortable asking them who this patient was and what brought him here. His name's Luke. He's 21 years old, a college student. His roommate woke up to him screaming in bed. I guess Luke shot up and grabbed a lamp on his nightstand, put the bulb right to his eyelids. Settled up the eyes pretty bad. I raised an eyebrow at the nurse, who shrugged in response. A light bulb? I asked, confused. Yeah, according to his friend, he's been sleeping with the desk lamp on. Tonight, he decided to take his nightlight a bit further. And apparently, he was screaming that his eyelids wouldn't open. I craned my neck towards the door Luke was behind and furrowed my brow in thought. Was this a panic attack? Does he have a family history of mental illness? The nurse crossed their arms and shook their head slowly. No, nothing sticks out. He grew up as an orphan, managed to work towards a full-ride scholarship for college. According to his roommate, though, he's been isolating himself recently, avoiding falling asleep and developing some facial tics. What kind of tics? I asked softly. I already felt my heart sinking for the boy. Half of his face twitches when he talks. My money's on anxiety from school. I thanked the nurse as the door opened. A few medical technicians stepped out, and their faces displayed a certain faint level of sorrow. Their gaze swept from the floor up to my eyes before they nodded, letting me know I could step in. I smiled at them reassuringly and walked inside the room. Luke was sitting in a wheelchair with soft restraints on his wrists and ankles. I noticed his eyes were open and bloodshot. The burns didn't make their way too deeply for tissue damage, but they certainly didn't help anything. I couldn't even imagine the damage that could have been done if that light hadn't been ripped from his face. I ended up taking a seat across from him, resting my elbows on my thighs and leaning towards the young man. Hello, Luke. I'm Dr. Michaels. I'm just here to make sure you're okay, all right? After a brief pause, the young boy spoke up, tears filling his eyes. I'm sorry, he said softly. I'm so sorry. The right side of his face twitched and spasmed with anxiety. His lips were curled into a disparaging grimace. Why are you sorry, Luke? You have no reason to be sorry, I coached. Something inside my heart gave for this kid. He seemed broken. I'm sorry for being here. I should have just handled it myself. No one else needed to be affected by this." Luke's voice cracked, and he began to let loose tears. His body was shaking under the weight of his silent sobs. No, don't you ever say that. We're here for you, Luke. This is our job. This is what we chose to do. I'd rather you be here right now than anywhere else in the world." Luke's body shivered as his tears rolled down his face. Half of his face quivered and shuddered in lieu of the other half. "Thank you," he said quietly, trying to recompose himself. "No need for that. Trust me, you're a breath of fresh air in here compared to some of the other people who come in." I shot him a soft smile, and he looked at me, making eye contact. Tears were still rolling down his face, but he returned the smile. "Now, Luke, what happened tonight?" Luke bit his lip and laughed lightly in weary defeat. "I'm going to be honest. I promised myself I'd be honest." "Good. We want that here," I chuckled, trying to lighten his spirits. "Well," he gave a soft groan, interrupting himself. I keep having night terrors." His gaze shifted down to his feet, and he looked embarrassed. "That's not uncommon. Trust me, a lot of people have them when stress creeps up on them. I'm not stressed out, though. Well, I wasn't. Not before this. It just happened one night, and now it won't leave me alone." Luke locked his jaw, exposing some sort of anger or bitterness towards his nightly attacks. "What are these dreams about, Luke?" It took a few moments of silence before he responded. Luke lifted up his head and looked over my shoulder. His eyes blackened with the dampness from his tears. They displayed a sort of depth to them that I couldn't fathom a 21-year-old student having. "It's always the same. I'm always well past dreaming. I'm in a deep sleep. It's darkness all around me. Depth, direction, it doesn't matter. I might as well be floating." His eyes continued to stare well over my shoulder at this point, his gaze 1,000 miles behind me, yet somehow focused. At first I liked it, those dreams. I never felt more rested after I spent a night in that empty place. It felt like medication, you know? He gave a quick laugh, anxiety creeping its way into his tone. "So, what happened?" I asked after he took a brief pause. "Well, one night, I didn't go where I normally went. It wasn't all darkness. There was something else there with me, pure white and deathly still. It was in front of me, no more than 10 feet away. I focused on it. I needed to know what it was." His shoulders shook up and tensed. He was scared. "I saw it. It was a face." "What did this face look like, Luke?" "It's white, like one of those old drama masks, but rounder and more expressionless. Looking at it gives off the feeling of it being old and abandoned. But there's a spark of something in its eyes. They're black and somehow shine even in the darkness around us. It's as if even the void doesn't dare block it out. And those eyes, they just stare off into whatever infinity that engulfs us." Luke began breathing more heavily and rapidly. He was on the verge of a panic attack, yet his eyes refused to shift from whatever spot he'd chosen behind me. "It's okay, you're safe. I'm right here." His body relaxed unnaturally quickly, yet his gaze was still resting off in oblivion. "You know what scared me, Doc?" Luke asked, his face now vacant. "What's that, Luke?" "I screamed, and it heard me." Luke's head turned, his eyes sweeping directly to mine. I felt all the hair on my body stand up on end. His eyes still retained that 1,000-yard stare, but they focused in directly on me. Not my body, no, but something under my skin. For a moment I stared back, frightened of this kid, This kid who was restrained to a wheelchair in a hospital full of security. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, and the worst part was, I could swear his face was getting closer to mine. Not his body, no. Just his wooden, featureless face. "We're going to have to prep him for sleep now, Dr. Michaels," a nurse called out from behind the door. This interruption was all I needed to snap back to my senses. Luke turned his head and stared at the door where the voice came from, right behind my shoulder. I could see a battle being fought inside his mind. He seemed distracted. "I'm really sorry, Luke, but we're going to have to continue this tomorrow, all right? Dr. Chen will be with you in the morning to try out some medicines to make your stay here a little more comfortable." I stood and gave a quick nod to the boy and left the room. I walked right by the nursing staff without a word and retreated to my office. I couldn't get the boy's face out of my mind. I was imagining Luke's face hovering closer to mine, detaching itself effortlessly from his shoulders. His skin was lifeless and white, as if the sun never kissed his flesh. I shuddered at the thought. Whatever my imagination was conjuring up of Luke was unfathomably intense, but I wouldn't let that stop me from helping him get through this. I spent the rest of my night drinking decaf coffee and researching different anxiety disorders that might fit in with what Luke was dealing with, but came up with nearly nothing. A few texts brought up fear of oneself, that nightmares of blank faces may be a reflection of who you are inside and the unwillingness to come to terms with it. I decided to make this my thesis on Luke. Whether that face was his fear of himself or not, if I could convince him to believe it, then maybe he'd lose his fear and gain some self-confidence to deal with whatever monster was in his life causing his nightmares. I spent the next few weeks with Luke and really got to know who he was. After we introduced him to new medications, he finally seemed to relax for the first time in a long while. He told me the medications were helping him sleep and that he was too tired by the end of the day to even worry about that white face appearing in his dreams. I took advantage of his newly found demeanor of his and began to help him visualize that face during waking hours and try to twist it into something he understood, maybe even his own reflection. I tried to teach him not to be scared of himself, that whoever he was on the inside wasn't as bad as he thought. It turned out Luke had a lot of self-confidence issues and always strove for perfection. He actually got pretty damn close by scoring top marks in his classes, but close still wasn't good enough for him. As an orphan, he never had anyone to make proud. It was at this point I became irresponsibly attached to him. I began to see him more as a son than a patient. We spent those next several weeks together, talking, reading, and watching movies. His intelligence was unmatched. He seemed to pull from a well of knowledge that even he was surprised to discover he had. Unfortunately, a seemingly healthy kid like him with no active suicidal thoughts can't stay in the hospital forever. We had to let him go. I told him if he ever needed anything to get into contact with me. His only request at that moment was for me to come to his graduation later in the year, since he had no one else that would attend for him. I know I did my best to make sure Luke could get the help he needed. I had worked hard with Dr. Chen to give him affordable prescriptions that would last at the very least a few weeks. We had hoped he'd get better, and for a while I didn't have any reason to think differently. Until I got a call from the hospital. "Dr. Michaels, Luke's back in the emergency room. He's requesting to see you." That's all it took for me to hop into my car and speed off to my workplace. I gave the hospital valet my car along with a sizable tip. I didn't want to waste any time. "Where's Luke?" I asked as I ran up to the emergency room receptionist. She looked at me with a worried look before pointing me off in the right direction. I sped down the halls as quickly as I could before I got to Luke's room. I took a deep breath and composed myself before twisting the handle and opening the door. There Luke was, surrounded by nurses. His arms were restrained to his sides. His face was heavily damaged by burns. Bloody gauze tape wrapped around his eyes and head. His lips were quivering with pain. Luke, I'm here, buddy, I said softly as I walked over to his hospital bed. I'm sorry again, he said, half as a whimper. I just wanted to give up. I looked over to the nurses who avoided my gaze. What did you do, bud? I asked, placing my hand over his. My eyelids wouldn't open. I tried so hard, but they just wouldn't. Luke started trembling. The face, it kept getting closer. I didn't know what else to do, so I pulled my eyelids off. I shuddered. I felt my heart breaking. He kept going. But even when they were off, I still couldn't see anything but that face. I thought maybe my eyes were the problem. He started sniffling, his expression slowly twisting into a sort of mania of panic. That didn't work either. I squeezed his hand trying to comfort him, to remind him he wasn't alone. Then what did you do, Luke? I asked. There wasn't anything left to do but look at it. It stared right in my face, acknowledging I was there. I wasn't supposed to be there. I turned my head away from Luke. I couldn't bear to see him have a breakdown like this. You know what I realized? It just wanted to be seen, Doc. It spent an eternity in darkness looking into the void. I think I was the first thing it's ever seen. I don't know what it is, but I know it's tired of being alone. Luke's expression turned into a pained smile, like he knew something none of us did, something none of us could. It's okay, Luke. We'll help get you through this. Just relax, all right? You've got help here. Luke's body sighed heavily. A few nurses worked to get medicine into his system. Dr. Michaels, can you do me a favor? I nodded before remembering his eyes were gone. I gulped down my tears and replied, Of course, bud, anything. Can you go to your office for a bit? I don't want you to see me like this. And please, if you visit me, just stay quiet. I patted Luke's hand, forcing a smile on my face. Of course, if that's what you want, I'll go to my office for a bit. I left the room choking back my feelings. I felt so horrible. I felt like I did something wrong. If I had just broken the hospital's rules and spent some time with him after he left, maybe I could have saved him from disfiguring himself. I walked into my office and pulled out some anxiety pills. I tried to avoid them, but that night I needed them more than anything else. I spent a few hours in silence. I so badly wanted to do what Luke asked of me, to avoid him that night. I was being selfish. I couldn't bear letting him suffer alone. I decided at the very least I could sit in and be quiet, just like he asked. I walked past nurses towards Luke's room. I saw the pity and sadness in their eyes. They knew who I was, that I get too involved with my patients more than I should, but I didn't care. I opened Luke's door and sat in a chair in the corner of the room. I let my eyes travel to the young man lying in bed. Luke's face angled itself in my direction. Not quite at me, but not far off. I instinctively gave a smile, but lost it when I realized the uselessness of the gesture. For several hours, Luke's blank face stared right next to me, as if waiting for me to speak up and let him know I was there. But I was tempted to do so. I didn't, though. I couldn't break his promise. After some time, I began to feel myself slip into a deep exhaustion. I knew I had to leave and get some sleep. I felt confident Luke would be okay that night. His face showed no pain or sorrow. He just was. I excused myself by giving a quick bow out of habit. His face followed the sounds of my footsteps out of the room. I once again took a walk past nurses and hospital staff that all had sympathetic faces directed towards me. They all remained silent as I walked past them. Eventually, after a long, quiet car ride, I arrived home. I walked inside, placed my keys and jacket away, and headed to my bed to lie down, not even bothering to take my slacks off. What had Luke seen? I remember asking myself as I stared at my ceiling that night. I felt my eyes grow heavy and I let sleep take me away. That night, I envisioned Luke's face from the first night I met him. How his gaze seamlessly shifted from 1,000 yards away to directly at me. I had a hard time sleeping as Luke's expressionless face stared at me from the darkness of my own mind. However, when I woke up the next morning, I had a new goal. No matter what it took, I was going to save Luke. I was going to get him the help he needed. I grabbed my work gear and headed off. I was going to make the most of today. I parked my car, walked up to the hospital, and headed straight for Luke's room. I opened it to find nothing. My first thought is that they sent him to behavioral health already, so I headed there. Once inside, I checked the patients list and saw he wasn't on it. I got worried. "Hey, where did Luke go?" I asked the receptionist, and she gave me a gentle expression. "The same place as last night, resting in room 13. I looked at her vacantly. She lost me. Room 13 is our code for the morgue. I was with him last night. Almost all night, in fact. That's not possible. I was with him no more than 8 hours ago. He was recovering." "I'm sorry, Dr. Michaels. I can't help you." She shifted her eyes behind me and waved over the next person in line. I refused to believe it. I walked over to our security desk and asked to see the footage from last night. There he was, still moving when I walked into the room. We had our conversation and I walked out to go to my office. I watched the footage from after I was out of the room. I watched as Luke started screaming in his hospital bed and began to convulse and seize. Doctors and nurses rushed in and did their best, but he fell still. After a few tests, they brought in the black bag and shipped him off to the morgue. No less than an hour later, the room was cleaned and I walked in and sat in the corner of the room, staring at an empty cot. I felt my heartbeat begin increasing rapidly. I thanked the security officer and ran to the basement, straight to room 13. The mortician allowed me entry and I rushed to the cold room. It was there I saw Luke's name tag. Time of death was last night. Within those few hours, I was gone. Whatever that was in bed staring at me wasn't Luke. I have no idea what it was. For a time, I felt insane. Maybe grief caused me to have false memories, but no one told me Luke had passed. How could I grieve for something I knew nothing about? And then I realized something. Luke knew this would happen. He warned me not to acknowledge him. If you visit me, just stay quiet. Whatever Luke saw noticed him because he screamed. It followed him. I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous. I know it's out there. Please, if you see a face in the darkness of your own mind, don't let it know you're there.